Henry VIII wasn't just a king, he was England's most notorious monarch. We remember him for his 6 wives, his break with Rome, and his transformation of England into a Protestant powerhouse. The Golden Court, the magnificent palaces, the royal banquets that lasted for hours. But behind all that power and splendour, beneath the jewelled doublets and ermine robes, lived a man whose body was literally rotting from within. A king whose personal hygiene was so revolting that even his closest courtiers struggled to hide their disgust. In Tudor England, cleanliness wasn't about health, it was about appearance. And Henry turned his body into a theatre of horrors. He believed water could kill him. He thought his royal blood made him immune to decay. He was wrong. Today, we're revealing the 5 most disgusting hygiene practices of Henry VIII, and the final one will make you question everything you thought you knew about royal power. The Great Hall at Hampton Court Palace, 1530, King Henry VIII sits at the head of the high table, his massive form draped in cloth of gold. Before him spreads a feast that would feed a village for a month. Roasted peacock stuffed with herbs, venison in rich wine sauce, and tray after tray of marchpane confections moulded into fantastic shapes. But watch his face as he bites down on a honey cake. Watch how he winces. Watch how he presses his hand to his jaw. Watch the dark stain that seeps from his gums onto the white linen napkin. Henry VIII had the worst teeth in royal history. Contemporary accounts describe them as blackened stumps and rotting pegs. The Venetian ambassador wrote that the king's breath was so foul that it could be smelled across a room. But this wasn't the result of poor fortune or bad genetics. This was the inevitable consequence of Tudor dental care, or rather, the complete lack thereof. In Henry's time, toothbrushes didn't exist. Instead, the royal dental routine consisted of scrubbing teeth with rough linen cloths soaked in honey-based powders. The irony was devastating. The honey that was supposed to clean his teeth actually fed the bacteria that destroyed them. The sugar in his diet, a luxury that only the wealthy could afford, created the perfect environment for decay. Every sweet he consumed was another nail in his dental coffin. Dr. John Chamber, Henry's personal physician, prescribed remedies that made everything worse. Ground pearls mixed with wine were supposed to strengthen teeth but actually abraded the enamel. Dried herbs burned in the mouth were meant to kill infection but left chemical burns on the gums. Most horrifically, the royal dentists would attempt to fill cavities with molten lead, creating infections that spread throughout Henry's jaw and into his sinuses. The psychological impact was enormous. Henry, who prided himself on his appearance and charisma, became increasingly self-conscious about his smile. Court portraits from his later years show him with his mouth firmly closed, his lips pressed into a thin line. But in private, the pain was constant and excruciating. He would fly into rages over trivial matters, his courtiers never realizing that their king was suffering from chronic dental abscesses that would have driven any man to madness. The smell was another matter entirely. Hans Holbein the Younger, who painted Henry's official portraits, complained in his private letters about the king's breath like a charnel house. Courtiers developed elaborate rituals to avoid being downwind of their monarch. They would position themselves carefully during audiences, carry pomanders filled with strong spices, and perfect the art of breathing through their mouths while appearing to listen attentively. But perhaps most disturbing was how Henry's rotting teeth affected his eating habits. Unable to properly chew his food, he would swallow large chunks of meat half-masticated. This led to chronic indigestion, which the royal physicians treated with purgatives and emetics that further weakened his system. The King of England was literally rotting from the inside out. One meal at a time, the teeth became a symbol of his entire reign, beautiful on the surface, corrupt beneath. Just as Henry presented himself as the defender of faith while destroying monasteries for their wealth, his golden smile masked a mouth full of decay. The courtiers who praised his magnificence were forced to endure the stench of his mortality. In a world where divine right was supposed to elevate kings above ordinary human frailty, Henry's teeth were a constant reminder that even God's anointed could not escape the consequences of their appetites. Greenwich Palace, 1536. The sound of metal on metal echoes across the tilt-yard as King Henry VIII thunders down the list on his massive destrier, his lance couched and ready. The crowd holds its breath. At 45, Henry is too old for this, too heavy, too reckless. But he cannot stop, will not stop. Pride demands that he prove himself still the warrior king, still the athletic prince who once dazzled Europe with his physical prowess. The impact is catastrophic. Henry's opponent's lance strikes him full in the thigh, penetrating the gaps in his armor and driving deep into the muscle. The king crashes to the ground, his horse rolling over his left leg with a sickening crunch. When they finally pull him from beneath the animal, his leg is twisted at an unnatural angle, bone protruding through torn flesh, blood soaking into the mud of the tilt yard. This accident created the wound that would torment Henry for the rest of his life, but calling it a wound is too simple. What developed in Henry's leg was a horror show of Tudor medical incompetence, royal stubbornness, and primitive understanding of infection. The injury never healed. For 21 years, until the day he died, Henry VIII carried an open, festering sore that leaked pus, blood, and fluid constantly. The royal physicians attacked the wound with every treatment their medieval training suggested. They packed it with bread soaked in wine, believing that grain had healing properties. They smeared it with hog's grease mixed with ground unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk powder that cost more than a manor house. They applied poultices made from crushed pearls and gold leaf, convinced that precious materials could cure a precious king. Nothing worked. The wound remained open, a gaping hole in Henry's leg that went down to the bone. But worse than the sight was the smell. Contemporary accounts describe an odour so foul that it could clear a room. The French ambassador wrote that the king's leg doth stink, so that none can approach him without great distress. The smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was the smell of rotting flesh, of gangrene, of death itself, taking slow residence in a living body. Dr. William Butts, Henry's most trusted physician, finally realized the truth that none of his colleagues dared speak aloud. The king's wound was killing him slowly, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The leg had developed what we now recognize as osteomyelitis, a bone infection that, in the 16th century, was essentially a death sentence. The only reason Henry survived was his incredible constitution and the fact that the infection remained localized rather than spreading throughout his bloodstream. The practical implications were nightmarish. Henry required constant attendance from servants whose sole job was managing his wound. They would drain the pus into silver bowls, change the blood-soaked bandages multiple times per day, and apply fresh poultices to skin that had long since died around the edges. The servants were sworn to secrecy about what they witnessed, but palace records show that Henry went through nearly 100 pounds of linen bandages per month. The psychological impact was even worse than the physical. Henry, who had built his entire identity around physical dominance and sexual prowess, was forced to confront his own mortality every single day. The wound was a constant reminder that his body was failing, that his divine appointment did not protect him from human frailty. He became increasingly paranoid, convinced that his enemies were using witchcraft to prevent his healing. But perhaps most disturbing was how the wound affected his relationships with his wives. Anne Boleyn, who married Henry when his leg was still a fresh injury, initially tried to tend to it herself. But as the smell grew worse and the sight more horrific, she began to recoil from physical intimacy. Henry's later wives learned to hide their revulsion, but palace gossip recorded their private complaints about sharing a bed with a man whose leg was literally rotting away. The wound became infected repeatedly. Each time, Henry would develop a fever that brought him to the brink of death. His courtiers would gather outside his chambers, making preparations for his funeral while listening to his delirious ravings through the door. But somehow, impossibly, he would always recover only to face months more of constant pain, constant drainage, constant humiliation. This wasn't just a medical condition. In Henry's mind, it was a divine punishment, a sign that God was displeased with his actions. Yet rather than inspiring humility, the wound seemed to make him more cruel, more desperate to prove his power in other ways. Unable to dominate through physical strength, he turned to executions and terror. The rotting leg became the physical manifestation of his rotting kingdom, a realm where power had become so concentrated in one man that even his infected flesh became a matter of state. The Presence Chamber at Whitehall Palace, July 1540. The morning sun streams through the tall windows, but inside, the air is thick and stifling. King Henry VIII sits on his throne of estate, draped in layer upon layer of clothing despite the summer heat. Beneath his cloth of gold outer robe is a doublet of purple velvet. Beneath that, a shirt of finest linen. Beneath that, woolen undergarments that trap every drop of moisture against his massive frame. By modern standards, Henry is grotesquely overdressed, but in Tudor England, clothing was power. The more layers, the more expensive the fabrics, the more elaborate the decoration, all of it announced to the world that here sat a man who could afford to wrap himself in more wealth than most people would see in a lifetime. The problem was that Henry couldn't take it off, not in public, not even in private most of the time. Royal dignity demanded that the king never appear less than magnificently attired. The result was a walking disaster of medieval hygiene. Trapped beneath pounds of fabric, Henry's body became a breeding ground for bacteria, fungi, and parasites. The sweat that poured from his infected leg wound, mixed with the natural perspiration of a man who weighed over 300 pounds, creating a toxic stew that soaked into his undergarments and stayed there for days at a time. Tudor bathing practices made everything worse. The prevailing medical wisdom held that water could penetrate the pores and introduce disease into the bloodstream. Doctors advised their wealthy patients to bathe no more than once per month, and even then only in water that had been boiled with herbs and blessed by a priest. Henry, terrified of any practice that might worsen his leg wound, often went months without a proper bath. Instead of washing, Tudor nobility relied on frequent changes of linen undergarments. The theory was that clean cloth could absorb sweat and odors, keeping the body fresh without the dangerous exposure to water. For ordinary people, this might have worked reasonably well, but Henry's lifestyle made it a catastrophe waiting to happen. The king's daily routine began before dawn with a process that took nearly 2 hours. First, servants would remove his nightclothes, which were often soaked with sweat and drainage from his leg wound. Then came the delicate process of changing the bandages around his ulcer, a procedure that filled the room with the smell of infection and decay. Next, they would attempt to clean his body with linen cloths soaked in rose water and wine, a process that Henry often cut short due to pain and impatience. The clean undergarments would go on first, woolen braize that reached from his waist to his knees, then a linen shirt that came down to his thighs. Over this went a doublet, often made of silk or velvet and padded with horsehair or cotton. Then came the outer robe, heavy with gold thread and precious stones. By the time he was fully dressed, Henry was already beginning to sweat. The problem compounded throughout the day. Royal protocol demanded that Henry appear in public for hours at a time, hearing petitions, meeting with ambassadors, presiding over court ceremonies. Under the hot lights of hundreds of candles, wrapped in his layers of increasingly damp clothing, the king became a walking furnace of trapped body heat and bacterial growth. Contemporary accounts describe the smell that followed Henry everywhere. The Spanish ambassador wrote that His Majesty's presence doth require much perfume to make bearable. Court ladies developed the practice of carrying small bouquets of herbs to hold discreetly near their noses during audiences. The royal chambers were constantly fumigated with burning braziers filled with expensive spices, but even these expensive measures could not completely mask the odor of a man whose body was essentially fermenting inside his clothes. The servants who dressed and undressed Henry bore the worst of it. Palace records show unusually high turnover among the grooms of the bedchamber, the men responsible for the king's most intimate needs. Those who stayed learned to breathe through their mouths and to move quickly through their duties. Some developed what they called court sickness, chronic nausea and headaches that modern doctors would recognize as the body's natural response to prolonged exposure to bacterial toxins. But the most disturbing aspect was how the sweat affected Henry's already compromised leg wound. The constant moisture trapped against his skin created the perfect environment for bacterial growth. The infection that should have remained localized began to spread up his thigh, creating a network of smaller sores and abscesses. Each new wound added to the toxic mixture soaking into his undergarments, creating a feedback loop of infection and odor that grew worse with every passing year. Henry himself seemed largely oblivious to the effect he had on others. Royal protocol required that no one comment on the king's appearance or person, so he received no feedback about his condition. When courtiers stepped back during audiences, he interpreted it as respect rather than revulsion. When servants hurried through their duties, he saw efficiency rather than desperation to escape his presence. The irony was profound. Henry, who spent fortunes on clothing and appearance, who commissioned the most flattering portraits and demanded the most elaborate ceremonies, was simultaneously creating one of the most repulsive spectacles in royal history. The man who wanted to be remembered as the most magnificent king in Christendom was actually becoming a walking advertisement for the failure of medieval hygiene. The King's Privy Chamber at Hampton Court, dawn 1545. Sir Anthony Denny kneels beside an ornate chair draped in crimson velvet and gold braid. This is the close stool, Henry VIII's personal toilet, and Sir Anthony holds the most coveted position in the royal household, groom of the stool. In his hands is a silver basin, elaborately engraved with the royal arms. In a few moments, it will contain the king's excrement, and Sir Anthony will examine it with the intensity of a scholar studying sacred texts. This was not humiliation. This was honour. In Tudor England, access to the king's body, any part of it, represented power beyond measure. The groom of the stool was one of the most trusted men in the kingdom, privy to royal secrets that could topple governments. But the price of that access was intimate knowledge of Henry's digestive disasters, and by the 1542nd, those disasters had become truly horrific. Henry's diet was killing him from the inside. A typical royal meal included pounds of red meat swimming in rich sauces, tankards of strong ale and sweet wine, and elaborate confections made with expensive sugar and exotic spices. His physicians encouraged this excess, believing that a king's digestion was naturally superior to that of common men and therefore required the finest fuel. They were catastrophically wrong. The result was chronic constipation punctuated by explosive bouts of diarrhea. Henry would go for days without being able to defecate, his abdomen swelling painfully as waste accumulated in his intestines. Then, without warning, his bowels would release everything at once in a torrent that could last for hours. The smell was so overwhelming that even the hardened servants of the Privy Chamber had to take turns stepping outside for fresh air. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the king's bodily functions, it was the ritual that surrounded them. Every aspect of Henry's waste was analysed, recorded, and interpreted as a sign of divine favour or displeasure. The colour, consistency, quantity, and odour were all noted in private journals that survived to this day. Royal physicians would examine the contents of the silver basin like fortune-tellers reading entrails, declaring whether the king's health was improving or declining based on the morning's deposit. The groom of the stool maintained detailed records of Henry's bowel movements. These documents, discovered in royal archives centuries later, reveal the full horror of the king's digestive condition. Entries describe stools black as coal with corruption, waste that did burn the royal fundament with its acidity, and bowel movements so large that they did require 3 men to carry the vessel. The practical arrangements were a nightmare of medieval engineering. Hampton Court alone contained dozens of garderobes' private toilets built into the walls that emptied directly into the moat below. But Henry, in his later years, was too weak and too heavy to safely use these facilities. Instead, he relied on portable close stools that could be brought to whatever room he occupied. The waste from these devices had to be manually emptied by servants who carried it through the palace corridors in covered silver vessels. The smell was inescapable. Despite expensive perfumes, frequent fumigation, and constant cleaning, the royal apartments reeked of human waste. Visiting diplomats complained in their private correspondence about the stench that pervaded the English court. The French ambassador wrote that, "The palace doth smell more of a stable than a seat of majesty." The papal nuncio reported that he could barely complete his audiences without retching. The psychological implications were staggering. Here was the most powerful monarch in Europe, a man who claimed divine appointment and absolute authority, reduced to having his excrement analysed by kneeling courtiers. The contradiction between Henry's public magnificence and his private degradation created a cognitive dissonance that affected everyone who witnessed it. How could a man appointed by God require such intimate assistance with the most basic bodily functions? Henry himself seemed to take perverse pride in the elaborate ritual. He would discuss his bowel movements in detail with his physicians, treating each successful defecation as a victory over his enemies, and each bout of constipation as evidence of witchcraft or poison. In his increasingly paranoid mind, even his digestive system had become a battleground between divine favour and demonic interference. The servants who managed these rituals developed their own coping mechanisms. They created an elaborate hierarchy among themselves, with senior grooms supervising junior attendants who handled the actual waste disposal. They developed techniques for breathing that minimized their exposure to toxic fumes. They created coded language that allowed them to discuss their duties without explicitly mentioning the horrific details. But perhaps most disturbing was how the royal toilet rituals affected the succession. Henry's legitimate son, Edward VI, grew up witnessing these daily degradations of his father's dignity. The psychological impact of seeing the most powerful man in England reduced to a helpless invalid may have contributed to Edward's own obsession with physical purity and religious extremism when he became king at age 9. The toileting rituals also became a form of political theatre. Access to the king during his most vulnerable moments allowed the groom of the stool to influence royal policy in ways that formal advisors could not. Important decisions were often made while Henry sat on his close stool, his judgment compromised by physical discomfort and embarrassment. The future of England was sometimes decided by men who literally held the king's waist in their hands. By the final years of Henry's reign, the close stool had become a symbol of absolute power's ultimate futility. Here was a monarch who could order executions with a gesture, who had broken with Rome and dissolved the monasteries, who had married and divorced at will, yet he could not control the most basic functions of his own body. The silver chamber pot, engraved with symbols of royal authority, contained the proof that even divine right could not overcome the reality of human mortality. The king's bedchamber at Greenwich Palace, midnight 1546, moonlight streams through the tall windows, illuminating what should be the most magnificent sleeping chamber in all of Christendom. The bed itself is a masterpiece of Tudor craftsmanship, carved oak posts reaching nearly to the ceiling, draped with curtains of cloth of gold embroidered with the royal arms. The mattresses are stuffed with the finest down, the sheets woven from silk imported at enormous expense from the Orient. But look closer, and the horror reveals itself. The bedding is alive with movement. Fleas hop across the golden fabric like tiny black dancers. Lice crawl in endless processions through the embroidered threads. Bedbugs emerge from the carved woodwork to feast on the massive form that occupies this palace of pestilence. This is the bed of Henry VIII, and it has become an ecosystem of parasites that would make a peasant's hovel seem clean by comparison. The problem began with Henry's size. By 1546, the king weighed well over 400 pounds, his body so massive that it required specially constructed furniture to support his weight. The royal bed was more than just a sleeping place, it was an engineering marvel designed to accommodate a man whose appetite for food had transformed him into a mountain of flesh. But that same bulk created the perfect environment for parasites to thrive. Henry's infected leg wound had never healed, and by his final year, it had spawned a constellation of smaller sores across his lower body. These wounds leaked constantly, soaking the bedsheets with a mixture of pus, blood, and lymphatic fluid. The royal laundresses, despite changing the linens daily, could never stay ahead of the contamination. Fresh sheets would be stained within hours of being placed on the bed. The drainage from Henry's wounds created a feeding frenzy for insects. Fleas, naturally attracted to blood and warmth, multiplied exponentially in the royal bedchamber. Palace records show that the king's body servants were issued special ivory combs, designed specifically for removing fleas from royal clothing. The servants themselves became so infested that they had to be isolated in separate quarters to prevent the spread of parasites throughout the palace. But fleas were just the beginning. The combination of Henry's obesity, his infected wounds, and the impossibility of maintaining proper hygiene had created a perfect storm of infestation. Body lice established colonies in the folds of the king's skin, feeding on dead tissue and reproducing at an alarming rate. These weren't ordinary lice, they were engorged creatures that had grown fat on royal blood, some of them reaching sizes that horrified even experienced servants. The bedbugs were perhaps the most disturbing inhabitants of Henry's sleeping chamber. These creatures, which typically measure no more than a few millimeters, had grown enormous feeding on the king's corrupted blood. Contemporary accounts describe bugs the size of grapes that would emerge from the wooden bed frame in armies each night. The royal pest controllers tried every remedy known to Tudor science, burning sulphur, spreading wormwood, even importing exotic powders from the New World, but nothing could eliminate the infestation. Henry himself seemed largely oblivious to his condition. His leg wound had destroyed many of his nerve endings, making him less sensitive to the bites and stings that would have driven another man to madness. He attributed the constant itching to evil humors in his blood, never realizing that his body had become a mobile habitat for thousands of parasites. His physicians, too terrified to suggest that their king might be infested with vermin, invented elaborate theories about how the insects were actually drawing poison from his royal blood and therefore helping to heal him. The practical implications were nightmarish for everyone who had to interact with the king. Courtiers who came close enough to kiss Henry's hand during formal ceremonies would often leave the audience chamber covered in fleas that had jumped from the royal person. The insects showed no respect for rank. They infested dukes and duchesses with the same enthusiasm they showed for servants. Soon, the entire court was scratching and clawing at themselves, creating a spectacle that foreign diplomats found both horrifying and amusing. The royal bedchamber required constant attention from an army of servants. Every morning, teams of cleaners would strip the bed completely, searching through every fold of fabric for insects and larvae. The mattresses had to be beaten and aired regularly, a process that filled the air with clouds of parasites that then settled elsewhere in the palace. The bed curtains were washed weekly in strong lye solutions that often damaged the expensive fabrics but did little to eliminate the infestation. The smell was another horror entirely. The combination of Henry's festering wounds, his inability to bathe properly, and the accumulated waste products of thousands of insects had created an odor so foul that it permeated the entire royal wing of the palace. The smell clung to clothing, hair, and skin. Visitors to the court would find themselves unable to escape it even days after leaving the king's presence. But perhaps most disturbing was the psychological impact on Henry himself. As his body deteriorated and his infestation grew worse, he became increasingly paranoid about assassination attempts. He was convinced that his enemies were using witchcraft to send poisonous insects to kill him. He ordered the execution of several suspected witches who he believed were controlling the vermin that plagued his body. The line between political paranoia and the reality of his physical condition became completely blurred. The servants who tended to Henry's most intimate needs developed what can only be described as a form of medieval PTSD. They created elaborate rituals for protecting themselves from infestation, wearing special clothing that could be easily cleaned, and developing techniques for holding their breath while performing their duties. Many requested transfers to other parts of the royal household, preferring even the dangerous work in the kitchens to another day in the pestilence of the royal bedchamber. The bed became a symbol of Henry's complete physical and moral collapse. Here was a man who had once been the golden prince of the Renaissance, now reduced to sharing his sleeping quarters with armies of insects feeding on his corrupted flesh. The magnificent bed, which had been designed to showcase royal power and majesty, had become a monument to the failure of absolute monarchy, to protect even its ultimate beneficiary from the consequences of unchecked appetite and medieval ignorance. In his final months, Henry could barely move from this bed of horrors. The parasites had become so numerous that they formed visible clouds around his body. The sheets had to be changed multiple times each day, but within hours they would be black with insects and stained with the products of the king's decaying flesh. The most powerful man in Europe was dying in a bed that had become indistinguishable from a corpse pit, eaten alive by creatures too small to acknowledge his divine right to rule. If you enjoyed the story of Henry VII, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.